Hello, hello, hello. Wow, what an incredible last 2 days. I hope y'all enjoyed the last 2 days of conversation as much as I did. We just heard from two brilliant panels centering parent voice and student voice. And we got this summit kicked off with two remarkable panels yesterday with Dr. Rebecca Tippett, as well as educators from across North Carolina talking about the present and future of Latinx education across North Carolina. What we wanted to do as we wrap up here is just briefly share our reflections on what we've heard over the last 2 days, and also what this means for us moving forward, not just as an organization, but as a community that's really dedicated to advancing Latinx student success across North Carolina. I'm really inspired. I'm really energized by these last 2 days, and I hope you are too. I wanted to lift up a lot of what we heard yesterday. We were enthralled by some of the beautiful visuals that we saw around the data points that Dr. Tippett was able to lift up, and there was a few really big takeaways there that I think we have to reflect on as we move forward in this work. Some of it was a conversation that we know is true if you've been doing this work or a part of our community, but that it isn't really a big part of our conversation. And that's the diversity of the Latinx community. Now more than ever, we need to be talking about the nuances in our community. As we said yesterday, and as was repeated today as well by Melanie, the Latinx community is not a monolith. And that is certainly the case here in North Carolina as we think about what it means to have a growing Central American community. What does it mean to continue to have foreign-born Latinos or Hispanics come to North Carolina? But also, what does it mean to start becoming a state that it bucks the narrative that we typically hear around an emerging community and really focuses on a community that has emerged, a community that is seeing second and third generation immigrants, folks like me and Elaine, right? We are becoming the status quo in North Carolina when we think about Latinx students, Latinx parents, the Latinx community in general. And so, what does this mean on how we think about the quote unquote newness of our community? I think that's a really important point that we begin to reflect on because it's certainly not the conversations we often have in our schools today. The other part that was really important for me in Dr. Tippett's conversation was around the reality that despite the evolution in immigration status for our community here in North Carolina, that the majority of our students are still first generation or future first generation college students. And we have the highest proportion of first generation college student of any subgroup in North Carolina, which means that the challenges of first generation college students are especially pronounced for the Latinx community. What does this mean for post-secondary education in North Carolina? What does it mean for our North Carolina attainment goals and the work of My Future NC? And what does this mean for our future workforce in North Carolina? Those are the sorts of things that keep me up at night as we think about, are we actually understanding the urgency of these issues in this moment if we want to prepare for the next 10 and 20 years of North Carolina's future? So an incredibly important point that I don't want to get lost in this moment. The other part that was really important is just the general presentation. The nuance in the data really matters when we're talking about education equity. It helps us understand the trouble spots and really helps us understand where do we go to tailor these solutions for our community. And so we saw a lot of that in the data yesterday. And if you didn't get a chance to participate in yesterday and you're completely lost with what I'm talking about, there's recordings that you can view in the main room here in Hopin, and the recordings for all these sessions will also go out after the summit. And so please tune in. It was a really rich conversation, but I think overall really underscores the need to have this data present for us to understand what this disaggregated numbers mean for our community. It helps us see a much clearer picture and what it means to really do education equity work on the ground. And so the data was rich. Check it out. Really great part of the presentation yesterday. And I want to mention two more things in regards to the second panel, because the second panel centered the voices of folks that we rarely hear from, which were Latinx educators. Dr. Ramirez, principal at Cedar Ridge High School, lifted up a few really big things, as did the rest of our panelists. The one biggest memory from yesterday was the fact that they all made sure to underscore that representation matters in our classroom. That was a given. That was a fact, that the foundation of our entire conversation yesterday. But Dr. Ramirez also pointed out two important things. We started a conversation around what doesn't just get teachers into the classroom, what keeps them there. And he started talking about the isolation that so many teachers go through, and that it is more likely for teachers to stay in the classroom if they have a friend. He talked about the mentorship he received as a young teacher. And I think that's really important, because we see this not just in education, but in a number of career fields where that mentorship and community of support, that village really, really matters. And so we have to begin thinking about how are we creating a climate for our Latinx teachers to feel like they belong there and that they have the support they need to succeed in their profession. A really important point that was lifted up that we can't lose sight of. The second part, which we didn't talk a ton about, but I certainly hear every day from teachers in Alamance County and across North Carolina, is the reality that, yes, teachers don't go into it for the money, but the money matters, right? We need to be paying our educators the value of their profession. They are the foundation of creating the leaders of today and tomorrow. They're the cornerstone of our democracy and our workforce, and educators should be paid as such. And so we've heard a lot of frustration on that front when it comes to educator pay and how difficult it becomes to recruit new teachers and to keep teachers when it comes to understanding just a family's needs, and can they really make ends meet on the current compensation levels that we currently have in North Carolina. And so Dr. Ramirez did not mince words when he brought that up as well in yesterday's conversation. So, the community support matters, the mentorship matters, but we also have to make sure we're taking care of our educators in this conversation. So really important things that I'm leaving this conversation with as I think about how do we continue this dialogue in our communities as well. And so we have two rich panels that we just listened to today, but I'll let Elaine have a chance here to really recap what we heard today.
Thank you, Ricky. And for those who are still with us, we'd love to hear your reflections from these past 2 days as well. So definitely go ahead and drop in the chat if anything really stood out with you or something that you're still thinking about. Maybe it's a lingering comment or quote, or perhaps even a question that you're still thinking about and thinking about what are the potential solutions to even the challenges that we heard across these past 2 days. One particular, especially from the two panels today where we had students and caregivers share their journeys and their experiences, especially in navigating a global pandemic and how this has impacted our families on the ground. I think there's a few pieces to point out here is that the resources that, especially in our last panel, that Sonia and Jenny lifted up, the critical need for emotional supports. I think this is also something being pointed out that this has not been there even before the pandemic for Latinx immigrant families, and the need for folks in schools that reflect not only the cultures, but also the languages that our community speaks, right? And I think this piece too, we hear it from the student perspective with Hector and Estrella and also Melanie explaining their journey, especially through that shift in the pandemic and the pressures of shifting to a virtual world, pressures of figuring out how to navigate also their own goals professionally and academically as well in a pandemic, whether that's applying to college, whether that's trying to figure out how to mobilize post-college. And so very important to think about this from a student perspective too, and just hear about the experiences that our families and students are experiencing on the ground, as well as the emotions that are tied up in this process. And so another piece I want to lift up from especially the last piece there was also the opportunity for leadership. As Ricky mentioned yesterday, a big theme was also the importance of representation. And this continued on in today's sessions, talking about how critical it is to have leadership that reflects our students, but also the opportunity for our families and our students to also be a part of that leadership. So making sure that we're listening to their voices and centering their needs is a critical part of this vision for educational equity. Another piece that came up that let me just check my notes here, was about culture, identity, and thinking about ways that we can really continue to preserve our connection to this history and our connection within the classroom and outside the classroom. And so exciting opportunities that we heard from students that have found those cultural spaces that they get to preserve their connection to their families, to their culture, to feel more at home in spaces where we often have not felt like we belong or have been made to felt like we don't belong just by the nature of being excluded from the conversation, whether that's only having English conversations or only presenting resources in English. I'm thinking about how that makes people feel to not be able to participate at all in the process. The second piece that, or excuse me, the last piece that I want to really mention is the opportunity for advocacy. So knowing our rights, knowing what we can be advocating for within our school system, also outside, right, in our larger community, at the local level, at the state level, etc. So the opportunity, like Islas Network that they're building, Padres con Voz, an opportunity to really elevate our caregivers' voice and also present opportunities for them to also participate in the advocacy efforts of how we are able to really mobilize within our education system and really transform these spaces to be more inclusive and equitable for our community. So those are a few highlights for me. Just going to go ahead and highlight a few comments that are coming through, but I think this piece around community was really powerful, just having a space where we could come together, get the real talk, hear about people's experiences, and also just grateful for folks who have been here supporting our folks as they get on stage and share, be vulnerable about their journey and about what they're experiencing on the ground. There's been a lot of opportunities also recognized. And so Ricky and I wanted to dive into some personal reflections as well of things that are resonating with us. And in order to do so, we wanted to actually share our values at Latinxside, because these values, they show up all the time. And sometimes there are some that are more on than others, or like really loud, right? And so Ricky, I wanted to see if you could start us off here, but talking about particular values that stand out from these conversations, and also maybe any reflections that you have that are connecting to that.
Yeah, I mean, these values were popping up in the comments. They're popping up in our panelist conversations. They're popping up in all of our presentations. So this really centered me when I was thinking about, well, where do we go from here? And for me, what I'm really reflecting on is our first value here on equity, a mantra we have at Latinxside. And if you've spent at least 3 minutes with me, you probably heard it come out of my mouth. But it's this idea that those closest to the problem are closest to the solution. Look at the brilliant conversations we just had, right? How many times do we actually get an opportunity to center the voices of those directly impacted? And so you are certainly the experts of your own experience, and that lived experience matters so much when we do this equity work. And so I'm really excited. Like Dyson mentioned in the comments, I'm deeply appreciative of the community we're building, because it is one that recognizes the need to center equity in all of the education work that we do, and the willingness to take risk and fail in that work as well. It's hard work. No one's kidding ourselves when we say that this is easy, especially in a moment where it feels like equity strategies and equity work is facing a backlash across North Carolina and across the country. When we really think about, well, what does it look like to have a full understanding of a complex problem and create targeted solutions for that? I believe that when we do that, we all win. A rising tide does lift all boats. But like Jenny mentioned in her comments, I loved her metaphor. And for folks who were not listening in the appropriate language, I'll recap it for you. Pretty much said, during this pandemic, we were all experiencing the same storm, but we were in different boats. And I think that for me is at the heart of equity, understanding that challenge and how do we make sure every boat is equipped with what they need to get through that storm. So Jenny, shout out for your metaphor. I'm gonna use it all the time. I'm gonna cite you, don't worry. But I think it's really important for us to center that, right? As we think about what equity work looks like moving forward. I think the other reflection for me is understanding family and community in this work is so important for our self-care and well-being, right? Like this work is hard and I couldn't do it with our brilliant Latinx family. I couldn't do this without Elaine or any of the folks that have supported us over the years. We need to understand what this looks like. And I'm reminded of a quote that Elaine shared with me earlier that goes something along the lines of, if you want to go fast, go alone. But if you want to go far, go together. And I think this conference, this summit for me is a reminder of that. Sometimes we get in our silos and we want to sort of figure this out on our own. There's a lot of incredible equity initiatives across North Carolina, a lot of emerging Latinx led initiatives or allies that are thinking about, well, how do we support this work to move forward? And sometimes it is hard to collaborate, it is hard to partner. But you saw all the energy, all the excitement in this chat. This has been such an inspiring 2 days for us. We weren't sure what was going to come out of it. We weren't sure if 5 people were going to show up or 5,000, right? Like we just had no idea. And the fact that 300 plus of y'all showed up and said, hey, we want to be a part of this conversation is really moving. And so I think that's less a testament about Latinxside and more a testament about us in this moment in North Carolina, where we are figuring out ways to collaborate, work together, and push this equity movement forward as we think about how do we make sure every single child in North Carolina receives that high quality education that is constitutionally their right? And how do we make sure every family has the tools to be successful when our systems do fail us? They are in a position to advocate in the way that Jenny and Sonia do every day. And so I'm thrilled that our familia just grew by 300, Elaine, and I'm really excited to see where this work goes moving forward.
I love that, Ricky, because those values are definitely standing out for me. And I think that if I could add two additional ones, it would likely be liberation and belonging. And what I mean by that, actually kind of tapping onto what you're talking about with familia, family, is just the importance of us building relationships in this process of getting connected, which again, this summit really represents an opportunity for new folks to get involved, especially as we push for educational equity for Latinx immigrant families. And the reason why liberation stands out for me is because it comes down to for the sake of what, right? We have a lot of there's a huge sense of urgency, and I think it's so critical to continue centering collective liberation. Our community is incredibly diverse, we're at the intersection of immigration, education, identity, and so it is so critical that we think about this from a really comprehensive view. And so I'm excited for the voices that we're going to be able to lift up by the nature of connecting with each other and building community and building these relationships. Another quote that we talk about a lot is just how change happens, and that really moves at the speed of trust. And so being able to really lay that foundation collectively is critical. Another piece is also freedom dreaming, imagining the world without all of these systems of oppression that are really holding back our community requires an intense imagination. So being able to release mindsets and also messages that have been holding us back is a critical part of this. And I think by hearing our students, our educators, and our families talk about their dreams, this is part of that process for us to really be able to imagine what educational equity looks like. And that is just as much a part of this work as taking action is, right? The last piece that I just keeps resonating with me is this piece around belonging. Having been raised in rural North Carolina, representing Waxhaw, there were so many times where I didn't feel a part of this larger community. And it was really hard to understand the roles I could play. It was really hard to see how my culture was connected to that. So the fact that we're out here creating spaces for belonging, and the fact that everyone, especially at this conference, you belong here. And we also have a call to action to ensure that our young people also feel the same way, that future generations of leaders are their space for folks to be a part of these conversations, and that we're thinking critically about who is at the table and who is not. So it's been really exciting just to have this opportunity, this summit, to jumpstart some of these relationships that we've been needing to form. And so just honored to be able to have all of us here together to really continue that freedom dreaming, and then also that turning into action, right? Turning these dreams into action. So as we continue to wrap up, we have a few extra things that we'd love to share with you to make sure that you get plugged in and that you know ways to continue to elevate your own leadership. So Ricky, I want to turn it over to you to talk about the listening tour that is coming up.
Yeah, of course. So if you're like me at any conference, you're like, all right, where do we go from here? What's next, right? Like I'm ready to go. I'm fired up. And so we want to give you all a chance to operate, and we want to give all of you a chance and opportunity to continue this dialogue. As we mentioned at the very beginning of this summit, this is only the beginning. This was meant to spark something, light a fire under all of us and say, how can we move this conversation into every corner of North Carolina? And so just earlier this month, we launched the Samos NC Listening Tour, or the We Are NC Listening Tour, to make sure that we're lifting up the voices of Latinx students, educators, and parents from all across North Carolina as we ask them, what are the challenges and opportunities facing our community, and how can we advance this topic of education equity from your perspective? And so as you see from this beautifully drawn map here, we're going to be taking this tour over 8 different regions in North Carolina. I won't get into the explanations on how these regions are drawn. It's a little wonky, but just know that we are taking a month-to-month approach to this and visiting every region in North Carolina between now and next summer, talking to folks both virtually and in person to make sure we're lifting up those voices. And so we're going to be doing a number of different things in each region. We're going to be having interviews with education leaders, nonprofit organizations, and our folks who are leading our educational institutions. We're going to be having interviews with Latinx serving organizations because we know that y'all are at the front lines of so much of this work, and that has especially been true during COVID-19. We want to host roundtable discussions with students, caregivers, and educators in a similar format as we just did over the last 2 days to make sure we center their voice as we move this conversation forward around equity. And last but not least, we're also going to be holding virtual town halls in similar format to recap what we hear in every region at the end of every month and allow folks to tell us, did we hear all right, or did we get this wrong? And folks tell us, you got this right, or you got it completely wrong, and continue this conversation around what this topic looks like in their context of their community. Because if there's one thing that's for certain, is that North Carolina is an incredibly diverse community from Murphy to Manio. And so we want to make sure we capture that nuance, we capture that diversity in all the conversations that we have. And so really the purpose of this tour, when you dig down into the details of it, is to identify barriers and opportunities to providing a sound, high quality education for every Latinx students in North Carolina. What does education equity look like for our community? And so we're going to be identifying that through our conversations. We also want to learn. We by no means have all the solutions to the challenges that we're facing, but we know that our community usually has a strategy that they've been implementing to make sure they can move the ball forward on these issues. So we want to learn about promising programs and practices and leaders from across North Carolina around what it looks like to serve Latinx families for them. And lastly, we want to engage with families. As we've been repeating over and over and over, Latinx families are at the heart of any solution, any good solution that we can create to advance education equity. So we want to make sure that they're at the center of all of these conversations around their educational experiences and hopefully amplify their stories and their leadership as well. And so we're kicking off this month in the North Central region. So between now and Thanksgiving, we're going to be chatting with folks from the counties that are on the screen right now. This is what is called the North Central region of North Carolina. And so it's a pretty big region, as you see, captures the greater Triangle area. It is much bigger than just the Triangle area and dips down all the way to places like Lee and Chatham County and as far north as Person and Vance County. So take a look on the screen. If you're on this screen right now, you're in one of these counties, please fill out the type form that is linked to the Hop-In platform. You can also find it on our website, or even check out the website in general for the Samos NC Tour and email our community organizer that is really heading up this whole effort. And so this is the conversations we'll be having. We want you to get involved. Check it out on Hop-In and the website. And in general, we want to hear from you. So we're excited to continue this work forward Thank you all so much for joining us for the 2 days of this summit. And we're excited to continue building the beloved community we know our students deserve. So, Elaine, I will pass it back to you for our final word.
We would be remiss to not take a moment to thank the incredible team that helped us pull off this summit. First, a huge thank you to our Latinxside staff members, Carol Bono and Caterina Marroquin. Y'all are incredible. If you see folks that are helping support our interpretation efforts, and then also our Twitter feed and making sure that we get the word out about this summit. These are the two incredible women right here that have been behind the scenes making it happen. So we're just so honored to have y'all as a part of our crew, and also wanted to say a big thank you to our interpreter team, Erika, Maria, Tamara, and Enrique. Thank you so much for your support in making this event bilingual. We so appreciate your efforts, and your hard work definitely does not go unnoticed. So thank you so much for your help and support. And so last but not least, ways to connect with Latinxside. Please, we'd love to connect with you, whether that's on social media. If you have a question, just shoot us over an email, or even getting registered for our newsletter, where you'll get hot off the press updates about all of our initiatives and our programs and opportunities that come out, whether that's everything from job opportunities to programs that young people are able to participate in, to leadership development opportunities, as you continue to also lean into those leadership abilities and being able to advocate for our community across the state. So we're so excited. Can't wait. I think I saw a comment earlier in a panel about creating directories. This is part of that directory, especially for folks that are interested in anything Latinx education. Even if you are in an adjacent field like social work, you name it, like there's a space for you. And we'd love to connect with you as we continue to mobilize our community. So again, a big thank you to everyone for your participation. And we so look forward to continuing the conversations. And so stay tuned for emails that we're going to send out, just that will recap this summit, including recordings and PowerPoint presentations, etc. And we're so excited to continue the conversation with you. Thank you so much, everyone. Take care.